All right.
There we go. Okay, so today I'm here with Brian. That way, here with Brian. Now, just a little intro. So my name's Tia, and I met Brian close to 10 years ago now, I think, just
Yeah.
in passing in my local suburb. And I think you did some stuff for me with the markets with the SES and different things like that. When my kids started school, your grandkids were at the same school. So we crossed paths quite a few times. And then a couple of years ago, I was working at the coffee shop making coffee. And one day you mentioned like this really weird random fact to me that sort of, whilst I never had the conversation with you about it then, it stuck in the back of my head. And when I started doing a lot of the background work with the Aussies and Kiwis for Anzac this year, because we're not allowed to have commemoration ceremonies this year, we have to, we're going to do the driveways at dawn and stand in your driveway and all those sort of things.
Yeah.
You kept coming back to my thoughts, that random fact that you had mentioned to me. So I did a little bit of research and I contacted you, obviously. And so today I'm going to talk with Brian, who wrote a book. And that book wrote a book and a screenplay and a movie. And I'm not sure which order they came in, and it doesn't really matter because the bit well, it doesn't really, because
Yeah, it's all right.
the bit that got my attention was the entire fact that when you were 12, you were cleaning out the garage, and what did you find?
Well, I found a whole series of papers and photos of something I had never heard about before from my father, which really was his role in the prosecution of nearly 100 accused Japanese war criminals on the island of Ambon, Indonesia, in early 1946. And he never mentioned any of this, and it took me for 20 years actually later, to finally have him agree to me doing something with this as a film or a documentary or a book. And then it took us another 5 years with my partner Dennis Whitburn and others, to get the film made in 1989 with Brian Brown playing the role based on my father. So it was a dramatisation. It was done as a film first. The book came later. And I think that really it was a long process that really paralleled the fact that the prisoners of war Australian prisoners of war so badly treated on Ambon by the Japanese. It was a big story for a lot of Australians, this, because there was a big silence over all this, and a lot of people didn't speak about the war, particularly prisoners of war, for what they went through. And it took until that mid-80s for my father to decide that it probably would be time that this story could be released. And that's the reason it took so long. I think it's nearly 40 years, so in other words, since the end of the Second World War, since we got started on this. And the great thing about it, I think, is that it enabled us to speak about this in a way on both sides, because my father, prosecuting this case along with the Australian War Crimes Tribunal, were very much bound by the Australian presumption of innocence and strict rules of evidence. So in spite of the fact that we had one of the highest death rates in a prisoner of war camp in any of the one run by the Japanese in Southeast Asia, nearly 50% of these Japanese were acquitted on charges of war crimes against the Australians for lack of evidence. Now, it speaks to, I think, the nature of the Australian values, that against the cries for revenge at the time, and they were very, very loud, I might say, because Australians felt that the Japanese had done barbaric things, and they had, that they were able to produce that result, and led to, ultimately, the film being previewed in Tokyo and attended by the actual veterans, the people he prosecuted all those years ago, 45 years before. And they invited him to the opening of the film in Tokyo in 1991, the 5th of April, just on 29 years ago, at which they gave a speech of apology for what Japan did, completely unreserved, and that had never happened before. So in a way, we were able to, with the film, create something that really, I suppose, we could never have predicted. That is, that the Japanese themselves would embrace the film, even though it is very strong on its portrayal of the barbarity and the extreme suffering that Australians underwent. So for me, that standing in Tokyo with my father that day was something that is unforgettable, and I think stands as a sort of bit of a landmark, I suppose, for our relationship with Japan, in that we're able to achieve that, whereas a lot of people would never be able to do that.
That's amazing. So your dad was part of the Australian Army Legal Corps. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct.
And so
he was sent there to do the initial investigation because when the Japanese landed on Ambon, and the reason they took Ambon is actually at a huge harbour, and they put their aircraft carriers and everything, and they established a prisoner of war camp. So it was a very strategic position on the northwest, off the northwest coast of Australia, 300 miles from Darwin. And so that's from where they launched the attacks on Darwin, from Ambon. So the prisoner of war camp was 1,000 Australian prisoners of war, just over. And when they surrendered in 1942, early 1942, the Japanese executed 300 of them, put them in a mass grave. And that was one of the first objectives. My father was to find that and ensure that they had the evidence to mount the trial, which was to be against, as I said, 91 of them, nearly 100. There were some anomalies with this in that one of the commanding officers who was involved in this had previously just been given a very brief trial because of no evidence, but prior to this was repatriated to Japan. And I suppose it is that issue that we dramatise in the film, particularly over the chain of command and the responsibility for that, because in Tokyo at that time, there was also preparations for the big trial of the Japanese government, Tojo and his colleagues. And the Australian government was very, very strident in demanding that the emperor himself be put on trial, which was refused by the American government and MacArthur. But that became a kind of a ricochet effect through other trials, because it was a question of the ultimate responsibility. And it was something that we then used in the film, but it never actually happened in real life on Ambon. But it was something we felt we had to deal with because it was the bigger issue that was overshadowing everything. So I remember actually being at the opening of the film at our local cinema in Roseville, and the widow of the president of that tribunal, which my father was the prosecutor, said to me, "You got him so right. He was a little bit too fat." So that was an endorsement. But I think the final thing came in for this with a speech of apology, which you've just shown on the screen there, which was the unreserved apology. We apologise for the actions of Japan. My father was asked by the media what was the crucial and most difficult issue in conducting the trial, and he said it was the chain of command. So in a way, that validated what we'd done, although our original agreement with my father in 1985 was that he could comment on factual matters associated with all these trials, which were quite complex and took us a number of years to dramatise into one, to make the film work as a unity, but he would not comment on the drama. So that was to hear in Tokyo that he said that. So yeah, it was a really good result.
For those that don't know, a quick look on Wikipedia, and I have put the link in the comments. It mentions that the Battle of Ambon was from the 30th of January to the 3rd of February 1942. And while at the time there was only sort of 15 Aussies lost in that actual battle, it was the aftermath. It was once things had changed that the surrendering. So there is proof, obviously, a lot of proof about 300 Australian and Dutch soldiers that were executed after surrendering. So which was correct. Where your dad got involved, and the paperwork that you found was based on that.
And that's right. And of course, he and I actually returned to Ambon on Anzac Day 1989, where we actually saw in the cemetery on Ambon all the graves of the Australians there, along with, would you believe, Damien Pera, the great war photographer. He was buried there as well. But we were able to have a very moving ceremony with all the survivors of the Ambon prison of war at the time, which then later, of course, led to us being able to interview them. And with a lot of them, as you would know, Tia, that there is this silence where they couldn't speak of it. And I think the film gave them the forum to do that and the ability to do that, which is on the DVD of the film, which is still out there, actually. You can still get it, if I may do a plug.
From 1989 on the DVD.
Yeah,
are they like the extras on the DVD?
It took us, the reason why we got the DVD done, I might say, is that Russell Crowe won the Academy Award for Gladiator. And just very briefly, he agreed to help us on this because this was his first film and it was a very crucial film for him. So we were able, with his help, I suppose, to get all my father's documents and these interviews with the POWs on this, because it became a way of, unifying the entire story with the film for the first time. So the DVD stands beyond the book. There's something that's got all the documents and all the actual archive from both sides, and that was a great achievement. But certainly, I think for me, the moment of it all was to not just interview the veterans from Australia, but to see what happened in Tokyo in 1991. That was, a day, as I said, we won't forget. Thank you.
Yeah, that's amazing. When we were sort of having our little chat beforehand, you also mentioned that that you've had a couple of pivotal sort of things come from writing this book. So the trip back to Ambon, to the Anzac Day ceremony in 1989. But you also mentioned something about Papua New Guinea.
Yes, that's correct. Well, as a result of the Blood Oath DVD, we were invited to, and that includes Deborah, my partner, and myself, to make a film about the return of Damien Pera's relatives to the Kokoda track, to put a plaque to commemorate his work up there, which was very famous. Kokoda Frontline was Australia's first Academy Award-winning film. And we did that, and of course he's buried on Ambon. So from that's how it's connected back to the story which we did for Blood Oath. But also, we were asked, as a result of the Blood Oath film coming out, that the people in Australia who had for many years had looked after the Cowra cemetery in Cowra for the Japanese and the Australians, to try to do a film about that as a drama. And we did attempt that, but we found that the difficulty there was that I still think there's reservations in Japan, maybe not now, but then, about being prisoners of war. So on one side, we had all the silence in Australia about the prisoner of war experience necessarily because it was so traumatic. But on the other side, we had the Japanese who could never acknowledge that they were prisoners of war, because the narrative was, if you like, or the accepted story in Japan was that they all died for the emperor. So the Cowra story was a total anomaly. But as a result of all the work of people in Cowra, my old friend Don Kibler, for example, well known for his work in getting the beautiful Japanese gardens in Cowra done, we've seen a great healing process done. And that's again because it reflects, I think, Australian values, that the Japanese recognise that we have looked after that cemetery, just as my father was recognised in Tokyo for his very fair prosecution of that case. They remember, those Japanese old gentlemen, those veterans remembered very clearly my father's conduct of that trial, and they hadn't forgotten it. So it says something about Australian values, and it's something we should actually really recall on Anzac Day, I think, because those are the kinds of values I think that were being defended by our grandparents, great-grandparents in the 20th century.
That letter that Brian keeps referring to is from a man named Peter, who was formerly sub-lieutenant of the first class Japanese Navy stationed in Ambon from 44 to 46. And he actually addresses the letter to John, which is Brian's dad. And it says, do you mind if I read it?
Sure.
Okay, so it says, welcome Mr. John Williams and Mr. Don Ball to Japan. I vaguely remember having met Mr. Williams once in Ambon many years ago. However, seeing him here today, I clearly recall that he had his right hand bandaged when we first met. It's the first time for me to meet Mr. Bull, but 10 years ago, he appeared in an article in, sorry, I can't pronounce it, but it'll be on the screen.
Yeah.
And I sent the clipping to Dr. Sissons at the Australian National University. And Dr. Sissons also sent me a copy of the Australian newspaper dated 22nd of July, 1981, which showed a photo of Mr. and Mrs. Katayama. Therefore, I feel as though this is our third time to meet. I would like now to express my impression of the motion picture Blood Oath. Beside the minor points, why was it that real names were used only for Mr.
Ikeuchi.
That's the one. And also why Mr. Ikeuchi was a naval officer in the films, as he was actually an interpreter. And I have quite a few other questions. But in short, overall, it was immensely an impressive film, which will remain in one's heart for many years. So it's nice that they acknowledged sort of a few things. And yeah, I mean, movies are movies, and everybody knows that whilst they might be based on truth, you know, to actually make it a story, there has to be a little bit of changing around of characters and things like that. But it was amazing that it was part of the speech of apology that that the work that your dad did brought that about, which is amazing. And I know he was only part of a team, but it's still an amazing thing that both you and your dad did. And it goes to, I know when we started this, the Anzacs page, that one of the things Jay said was, you know, or that Justin said was, let's get those stories out there. And your story is amazing. And I can't thank you enough for trusting me and coming and giving this a go today and sharing your story, Brian. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tia, and I hope that people take it in and consider it. But I'm very glad to be able to speak about it. I haven't spoken about this for a very, very long time, but I think now with the world going into potential conflict again, as we've seen, it's very important to remember not just Australian military traditions and the sacrifices made, but also the values of that for which we were fighting or engaging with people. Also to be able to, as we've done with this, reconcile. So that's really been a feature of this work, I think, both with Blood Oath and the other films, to do that in a way that honours those, you know, our ancestors in a way that I hope they would be proud of, you know.
No, amazing. One of my sort of mottos is, you know, I do what I can, where I can, or however I can. And the fact that you have created this legacy for generations based on a few bits of paper that you found in the garage when you were 12 is just phenomenal. So thank you very much for sticking with it and producing this for the generations to come. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.